Let's talk about the empirical rule. So the empirical rule helps us approximate the amount of data values that will fall within 1, 2, and 3 standard deviations away from the mean. So we will be able to say that within plus and minus 1 standard deviations, that will be about 68% of our total data. Between plus and minus 2, that's 95%. And plus and minus 3 standard deviations is 99.7% of data. Now, you've probably heard at some point in time about bell curves and how most data will fall around the average. And then as you get further and further away from the average, there'll be less and less data points. That's what the empirical rule is showing us here. When we're close to the mean, when we're just plus and minus 1 standard deviation away, that's 68% of our total data. And then as we get further into this video, when we start to see a bell curve, we'll notice that it becomes less and less as we get further and further away. Now, any data points that are more than plus or minus 3 standard deviations away are considered outliers. Right? Notice how that's not 100% for plus and minus 3 standard deviations. It's 99.7%. So there's 0.03% of data that falls into this outliers category. So here's our bell curve. And we see up there in the upper left, our mean is 80 and our standard deviation is 5. So we toss our mean there in the center. And then we put our standard deviations on the positive side and on the negative side of our bell curve. Now, between 75 and 85, so imagine if these are test scores, right? If 80 is the average test score, we would be able to assume that 68% of all of the test scores are somewhere between 75 and 85%. Now, 95% of the test scores will fall between a 70 and a 90. And then 99.7% of the test scores will fall between a 65 and a 95. That is the empirical rule. This bell curve showing each of these amounts, showing the 68, 95, 99.7, this is what we need to remember for the empirical rule. Now we can break it up into each section too, right? If it's 68% between 75 and 85, a bell curve is symmetrical. So that means between 75 and 80, it's 34%. And between 80 and 85, it's 34%. Between 70 and 75, it's 13.5%. And it's another 13.5% between 85 and 90. And then we have 2.35% between 65 and 70, and between 90 and 95. So this is what I was talking about earlier. As we get further and further away from the mean, there's fewer and fewer observations, right? Just 2.35% of all students got somewhere between a 90 and a 95. But 34% of students got between a 75 and an 80. And so we can use this empirical rule to make these assumptions about our data.